Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested, and today I'm going to be reviewing, finally, the Snapmaker U1 multi-material 3D printer. I know a lot of you have been curious about this, and some of you may have backed this very successful Kickstarter that Snapmaker ran last year. This is a production unit. The units are shipping to Kickstarter backers, and Snapmaker sent us one to check out, and I've been using this for the past month or so, and it's a really, really interesting FDM printer because on its face, its size, and looking at its Core XY design, there are so many things that will remind me of, what Bamboo Labs has put out with its X1C and their P2S mid-range 3D printers they launched last year. But in the same vein, the multi-tool head design is very reminiscent of what Prusa has done with the Prusa XL, with its 5-tool head changing system on a much larger build volume. So to have a multi-tool head system that we'll dive deeper into, but in a smaller, more desktop and maybe hobbyist form factor, there's really nothing like this in the marketplace today, at least nothing yet. But let's talk about the anatomy of the machine and its features, because looking inside it, it has a very familiar Core XY design. I can tell the places that Snapmaker chose to, put the money into, and the places that maybe they chose not to invest as heavily into, knowing the price point and knowing the type of user that might use this. You have 2 carbon rails for the X-axis movement, again, similar to the P2S and the X1C. This is not a linear rail system that you see in the H class of printers, but for this size, doesn't need to be. You have a single rail on each side for the Y-axis, and then 3 lead screws for the Z-axis. What's interesting here is those 3 lead screws are rotated clockwise, so you have 2 in the back or the left side there, 1 on the right side, and what that means is without any type of vent on the back is actually see-through. It's a clear piece of transparent plastic, and I actually really like that design. You can open the glass door, you can see all the way through, more light comes in, and if you have a print setup where the printer is kind of in the middle of an office table or on a print farm with the shelf off of the wall to run any maintenance in the back, I just like visually that design a little bit more. You see things like a standard blower on the side here that blows air along the plane where the hot end extrudes the filament. The build plate is what comes with this. It's a textured PI steel plate. It's 270 by 270 by 270 millimeters as its build volume. So a little bit bigger than the 256 by 256 by 256 of the X series, P series, and A series on the Bamboo side, but not as big as the 300 millimeter by 300 millimeter or larger that you've seen from like Creality or the larger H series Bamboo printers. And so we're talking hand props, miniatures, figures. You're going to be able to make masks with this, but not helmets or necessarily full-size pieces of armor without having to split things up. So definitely more in the hobbyist or enthusiast space, and maybe even for people doing a little bit of small batch manufacturing. On the left and right side, you have filament spool holders, and so this does not come or it doesn't support any type of external filament feeding system like the AMS. Instead, it's kind of like Bamboo's AMS Lite. You have these spool holders that rotate, 2 on each side, as well as 2 feeders, 1 on each side, and so 2 spools of filament can feed through a single motor feeder, and each of those feeders feeds into a separate bound tube for each of the tool heads. There's no external shroud covering, so it's not an enclosed printer, although Snapmaker does sell for pre-order a plastic enclosure with a little bit of temperature management with 2 fans in that, but that is for $150, hasn't shipped yet. Some people have been able to find some nice clear 55-liter plastic bins that you can get from a hardware store that almost perfectly enclose on top of this, and some people have even designed 3D printed brackets to mount those bins if you want to enclose the heat, even just to dampen the sound, because without this being enclosed, it does get a little loud when it's printing. Without the enclosure, it's also not really made for materials that require a lot of heated build volume. So, ABS won't print well on this until you have the enclosure. And in fact, to heat the volume, you're relying on the print bed here to heat it. There's no dedicated blower like there is on the H series of printers. Again, they're making these trade-offs, these decisions to maximize all the money into the tool head exchange system. And so let's talk about that exchange system, because there's a bunch of different ways to implement multi-material 3D printing with an FDM printer. If you're talking about using just a single nozzle, single extruder system, like your A series, your P series, your X series, you can still do multi-material with the AMS, but that's going to generate a bunch of purge waste. With every color swap, every material swap, you're retracting the filament, you're purging out any filament left in the hot end, and then you're reheating up that hot end, priming, wiping on a prime tower, and then starting it. So very time intensive as well as very wasteful. It's why you see that big piles of filament poop when we reviewed the A1 and A1 Mini. And that's why it's not very practical to print in multicolor for single objects, at least with those printers. You can kind of amortize that waste if you're printing a big matrix or grid of different objects. You can go with dual extruder systems. And so, Ultimaker, MakerBot, they had dual extruder systems, and Bamboo has one with the H2D. And so here it is two nozzles attached to a single extruder, and the two hot ends swap places. And here you have two sources of filament input. And so whether you're attaching multiple filament feeders, multiple AMSs, or you just have two spools on the outside of the printer, you're able to minimize a lot of that waste by printing two or more colors. I had some success, printing objects where there was one dedicated base color that I would have dedicated to an external spool, and then using the AMS to feed in the other colors, and really choosing objects where I can orient the object so when you do a cross section, you wouldn't have a ton of colors per cross section. If you're just talking about two colors per cross section, it actually isn't a ton of filament waste. But if you want to go with multiple colors, or you have these really complex designed objects, you're going to need either multiple extruders somehow, right? And so Bamboo's H2C printer chose to implement multi-extruders with different hot ends. Lots of different hot ends, up to 7 of them in a kind of mechanically complex hot end exchange system mounted to the right side of the H2C. And this would swap in those hot ends, these individual magnetically, induction heated hot ends, magnetically connected to the extruder, lock it in, and you would also then be able to print 7 colors or more without having a ton of filament waste. Now, in my testing of the H2C, the thing I found that still required some time in swapping those hot ends, because you're still talking about 2 sources of filament input. So you have to still retract the filament into the AMS, pump new filament in, you heat up the hot end, which took 7 seconds, and then you still have to do wiping on a prime tower. And so to do a color change, it would take in the order of about 40 to 45 seconds per swap, which adds up to when you're talking about prints with many hundreds of swaps. With the Snapmaker U1 and what Prusa did with the XL, instead of swapping the hot ends, you're swapping the whole extruder assembly itself, the entire tool, as it were. And so that's where the money is put into this machine. You have 4 different tools. Each of these tools is its own kind of complex system with its own data and power, with a filament that feeds directly in. It has its own replaceable nozzle. So while it comes standard with a 0.4 millimeter stainless steel nozzle, that's great for your standard PLA, PETG, you can swap that out with a hardened steel nozzle that you can buy from Snapmaker if you want to use nylon or carbon fiber filaments. And you can also swap it to different sizes as well, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. These are all aftermarket accessories. So what happens is that you kind of have to, with each print, decide what filaments you're going to use, because there is no swapping beyond these 4 filaments. There's no automated swapping, I should say. You can manually adjust the G code and pause a print and swap a new one in. But for automated printing, you're talking about 4 materials, 4 colors. That's what you get. And all that loading happens as part of the setup process. So you set up your prints by preloading the filament in here, and it's a very simple and automated process. And then as you set up the printer, the tool heads themselves go through their own calibration process to make sure they're perfectly aligned. There's actually a lot of calibration. There's your standard motor vibration, there's calibration, dynamic flow calibration when you're using new filament. But what's really important for multi-tool head is the calibration for the zeroing of each of those tips of the nozzles, because there can be slight variances as you're swapping out nozzles or swapping out these tool heads. Thankfully, that's all very simply automated. Actually, below the build plate, there's this calibration ring, and once you set it to go, it takes about 15 minutes. Each of these tool heads gets mounted onto the tool carriage and does kind of dance around the calibration ring to know where it should be, and then doing a little bit of math internally, it zeroes and finds its offset. And what I found is that once it is perfectly calibrated, and once you have the filament loaded in, and Snapmaker makes their own filament with RFID chips to automatically recognize, but it will, of course, accept very standard spools of filament, and even bamboo filament that prints just fine on this, you get very, very clean multicolor prints. And so I did a bunch of printing, including, the standard test print that comes with the machine, this multicolored dragon that I'm sure you've seen lots of instances of. That one, of course, is no problem. But for something like Prusa's bench bin, you can look at the large flat back of this print. This is a vertical surface, single color, and it looks almost perfectly clean. There's no bumps, no sign of any, no stringing. It's just a nice, clean, flat surface. If you look on the flip side, and this is now then multiple colors, black and green, no color bleed. Everything is perfectly, the seams look all perfectly aligned. I see a little bit of stringing going onto these diagonals. This is a little bit more stressful because each plane, they're shifting it a little bit. And I think the white filament here either needed its K value adjusted in its dynamic flow, or maybe it wasn't as dry as much. But the alignment is perfect, but the actual quality of the filament, that flow, could have been improved just a little bit. And then, of course, coming off the printer, all the parts, all the articulated parts work perfectly. Everything works really well. And it's really funny because this bench bin that Prusa developed to stress test multi-material printing was really meant to showcase purge waste. And for this one, there is no purge waste. There were the 4 pieces of filament that I loaded in and fill into a little reservoir when you load the filament into the printer, but when it's printing, there is no additional waste for 4 colors. If you're printing, objects for your kids, and as a parent, I print a lot of toys for my kids these days, and I'll be honest, they like the multicolor stuff a lot more than the single color stuff. This has been a really nice machine for that. And 4 colors is, I think, the bare minimum for having something that looks effective, right? If you think of 2-color objects, they're nice. But if you're thinking of figures, you kind of want black, white, because you're going to need, maybe eyes, right? White in the eyes for a character. Usually have like a peach or a beige color for printing skin, and then like an accent color. And so 4 colors gives you a little bit of robustness. It just takes those prints, if you're looking for just aesthetics, into a little bit of a higher elevated state. There are versions of Orca Slicer, which is what Snapmaker uses for this printer, that will allow for blending of colors. And so you can start using white blended with red to make pink. And then there you can kind of have almost a gradient of colors, but I haven't messed too much with that. And then also in terms of the software that's used for this printer, it is Orca Slicer. You can use standard Orca Slicer. Snapmaker has their version of Snap Orca, and they also have like a mobile app. So very similar to the Bamboo experience, although everything is maybe a little bit less robust. I mean, there is a camera here, a webcam. There are 2 lights, and there's a little privacy screen that you can use to block the webcam. And you don't need to use any of their cloud services or online services. If you don't want to use their app, you can run this directly plugged into the USB port on the back of the printer, and you can run it Kepler's Fluid UI web interface in a web browser, and that does just fine. There's a lot of customization you can do, and people are just starting to tap into that as this is reaching into people's hands. I did find that the mobile app was a little bare bones. You can do essentially the same stuff you can do on the on-screen menu in terms of moving the XY axis, monitoring some of the temperature, checking the webcam, but push notifications aren't enabled yet. I can't upload a slice file from there just yet. Can't download a time lapse, for example. And so a lot of those features are still hopefully yet to come. And reliability wise, I was able to run prints mostly without issue. Although on a few prints, I did a couple multi-day prints like this mask and this tall neck from Horizon. And in both these cases, these are like, there's a 2-day and a 2.5-day print. The printer did have an issue in that it stopped printing a couple times along the way. The carriage was unable to automatically pick up one of the tool heads in a tool head swap. There's one case where the tool head kind of was mounted back improperly and it was left ajar. And so you have to then go to the printer and kind of manually mount that back in. I had that happen once, but multiple occasions, it just was unable to pick up the next tool head for the next color. The printer paused. I noticed it a couple hours later, and then I was able to resume it remotely using the Snapmaker app. And thankfully, I was able to resume it, didn't have to kill those prints completely, but you can see on a print like this, there was layer shift on here both times where the tool head pickup failed. So maybe that's something that can be improved with firmware. It's nice to know that I could resume it. At least it wasn't a print breaking error, but I wish I had better indication of that or a setting to have it at least try again. Because the way this works and the tool head exchanges take about 15 seconds each. So that's a fraction of the time, that 45-second time on the Bamboo H2C. Those 15 seconds are about 3 seconds to actually swap the tool head itself and about 10 seconds to actually do the priming wipe on the prime tower. All that also has to include the heating of the hot end as well. So if you're printing with four different colors, 4 different materials, one of the ways it keeps that tool head exchange being pretty quick is that when these are in use and when they're docked, but when they're getting ready to be used, they actually keep at a higher 70°C idle temperature. Well, when they're not in use, they're about 20 degrees or so. So keeping those hot ends heat up to 70 degrees, keep them at the ready as they're being swapped. That can be a power draw. And so we also tested the power consumption of the U1, and it actually surprised me a little bit. It wasn't as big a draw as I thought. I guess it makes sense that keeping temperature at a relatively high idle and then heating the hot end up quickly as it's being swapped into the exchanger and into the carriage, that's the place where the power consumption might spike up. And so it really jumps up to a little bit above 250 watts when it's heating up. And then during normal operating printing, it really hovers under 200 watts, like 170, 180 watts normally. Not bad at all when you're considering the larger, more power-hungry bamboo printers can go up to 400 watts of usage, and it can even trip breakers as it's done in my house from time to time. And all of that to say, this is less of a big, robust industrial machine that, like the more expensive, Bamboo H2C, the H series printers, or even the Prusa XLs that can print really big objects. By focusing on this 270 millimeter by 270 millimeter by 270 millimeter print volume, it really is taking multicolor, multi-material printing more into that desktop world where you might be printing a couple objects or you need something quickly done overnight, not necessarily in the world where you might be needing to make 16 different things and batches of products and a machine running 24/7 nonstop for selling at a farmer's market or selling on an Etsy store. And that's actually a really great place for this machine to be at $850. It's $50 more than the P2S, which has the AMS2 Pro included, and that can do with its hardened steel nozzle, your engineering filaments. You can do, ABS in that one. You just a little more prototyping than you can with the Snapmaker. And here, if you want to do those, you have to invest in aftermarket accessories. And one of the questions I had about this printer was, what was that support going to be like, both in terms of information, resources, parts, and community support, as well as third-party support. And thankfully, given how successful this machine has been in the pre-sales market, they've sold over 20,000 of them, and how happy people have been with them after they've received them, it seems like Snapmaker has been pretty great about updating the firmware, putting out videos for how to fix and replace parts, as well as a timeline for when new parts might be available, as well as when they're going to get all of their units out to their backers. And we're even starting to see third-party accessory makers make accessories like their own filament storage systems, their own enclosures, different ways to upgrade the Snapmaker U1, which is always a good sign, because the more invested a community can get into these machines, the better support it's going to have. I have seen already in my time testing this updates to the firmware, and so those are coming and forthcoming with word on updates to the software. But so far I've been very happy with this machine. Even if you're just going to use it to mix PLA and PETG for support interfaces, one of the best ways to take advantage of multi-material printing, print in one material like PLA, have your supports also in PLA, but have the support interface, that last layer, be in a material like PETG, set that Z height to 0 for the interface, and then your supports come off very easily and with less of a marking on the prints themselves. So this is the Snapmaker U1. I'm going to be interested as Snapmaker releases more accessories for this. I want to get a couple 0.2 nozzles in to do some multi-color tiny miniatures. But so far, as a hobbyist machine, I really do recommend this and like it a lot. If you've been using the Snapmaker U1 or you have some more questions about it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. But thank you so much for watching. I'm Norm, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much for watching that video. If while watching any of my videos you like any of the t-shirts that you see me wearing, well, you can go buy them. And there's two places you can get them. First, you can go to tested-store.com, a web address that my crew laughs is one of the hardest things for me to remember in my whole brain. But now they've given me a second URL. You can now go to adamsavage.com and buy any of the t-shirts you see me wearing on this channel. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff there too. Thanks.